Sego, and welcome to Let's Talk Native. It is June 30th. Welcome to Let's Talk Native on the LTN Radio Network. This program breaks all the rules for Native radio. No buffalo speeches, no mystic healing, no special Indian prayers. We tackle the real issues facing Native people with a look back at our glorious and our grave history, a tough look at where we're at now, and a look forward to our ongoing battles for sovereignty and autonomy. Let's Talk Native is produced in association with Iroquois Promotions on the LTN Radio Network, streaming live from the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation and rebroadcast by great stations like The Gway in Tanganyika, CKWE, and of course Netroots Radio, Real People's Media, and Indigenous Resistance Radio. You can listen to the audio if you go to www.ltnradionet.com. That is where we stream the audio live. We also are streaming on Facebook. So if you're hearing this and you want to catch some video of us doing the show, see the faces we make when we say some of the things, so you can tell we're serious or not. You can join us, join our video stream. We also have got the website's up, we got the number up, and that kind of stuff for people to call in. So we if you watch the video, you may get a little bit more, maybe a little more insight on what we're doing and what we're thinking about, how we what our inflections are, I guess. And you can see that by going to our group page. Our group page is Let's Talk Native with John Kane. So if you join that page, I've got 7,000 members on that page. So if you're not on it, then you should be on it. And by going on it, you'll catch these live streams. We do a show every Monday and every Friday, 9 to 10. And we've got a good one lined up here today. As I say in my opening, we're going to talk about some of the tough issues, and we're going to talk about some of those tough issues. Let me back up. Let me introduce everybody. I'm John Kane. I am the host and the producer of the show. I've got Matt Hill on the board, and I've got Ed Schindler, supporter and participant, good voice on some of these issues. And we've got kind of an interesting one to talk about this time, and we're not going to do it alone. We've got Shane Einen, who's going to join us, doctor of psychology and psychoanalyst. He's going to join us. We also have off mic. We've got Jake Proud, who's recording, doing some video recording. He will put this show up on our YouTube channel, which is Let's Talk Native TV, and we'll post that up in a day or two. I encourage people to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube and look for Let's Talk Native TV. By subscribing, you'll get emails and notifications every time we post up a new video, and we will be doing more videos. We're constantly working every week towards refining our studio, our video studio, not just our audio studio here. So we will have more to offer in terms of communication, in terms of conversation, and we've got a good one going on tonight. Here's what: if you never heard of this, I'm gonna throw a term at you that you may have heard of, because it has gained some traction. The term is called, or the expression is called, cognitive dissonance. The definition of cognitive dissonance is the state of having inconsistent thoughts, beliefs, or attitudes, especially as relating to behavioral decisions and attitude change. Now, I know that sometimes the words seem like psychobabble, and the definition can sound the same, but let me break it down for you. What cognitive dissonance is, it's the struggle that we have with what we do in terms of our behavior when it conflicts with our belief systems. And I think cognitive dissonance with Native people takes on a whole nother meaning, because our belief systems, the ones that I'm speaking of, are the ones that are culturally bound, historically bound. So when we talk about the history of genocide, the history of residential schools, the history of land theft, and who perpetrated these things against us. Now, the thoughts, knowing those things, and then the behavior, how much, and I'm not talking about forgiveness here, but how much we can ignore that history by doing things like, frankly, worshiping in the very churches that called for our annihilation and our dehumanization. Enlisting in the armed forces that were responsible, the same armies, the same militaries that were involved in massacring our people, I think Mankato, Minnesota comes to mind. That was a military execution performed by the military, signed by the President of the United States. The other, there you go. That's another one. The idea of being enamored by the President of the United States, even though we have a word for the president, Ranadagayas, which means town destroyer, and that's a loose definition. But we get into that mindset, into that I guess that conflict. There are other areas of this. I mean, alcoholism. We know that alcohol was used as a weapon against our people. It was used for treaty negotiations. It was used to destroy our people. Ben Franklin, I don't know if maybe I'll find that quote here. Ben Franklin said, "Look, if it is our, if it is the desire to, to destroy these people, I would suggest that that rum might be the means for that." Mm-hmm. That's Ben Franklin. So even though we know all that, we knowingly and willingly participate in the consumption of alcohol. Even again, culturally, the Code of Handsome Lake, born here in the Seneca Territory by Handsome Lake, right? The code was named after him, right? Gardiwillo. It strictly prohibits alcohol. Yet, the very people who go to Longhouse and essentially treat the Longhouse as if it is a church, oftentimes are people who are consumed with alcohol and are plagued with alcoholism. That's the cognitive dissonance that I'm talking about. Knowing the relationship, the submissive and subjugative relationship to the United States and the view they hold towards Native people. And I'm not just talking about Donald Trump. You can take your pick. There's 45 of them to choose from. They've all viewed us as beneath them. Yet we'll still wave their flag. We'll sing the U.S. national anthem. God bless America, America the beautiful. We do all that stuff. That's cognitive dissonance. That's the idea of our behavior being inconsistent with the knowledge. And I'm not just talking about beliefs. Beliefs are things that you are told, but we know what the histories are. We know the role that churches played in residential schools. They don't need to scoop up our kids and run them off to residential schools. We'll bring them to church all by ourselves. So that's what I want to talk about. And I'm going to have Dr. Shane Einen join us. He's a doctor of psychology, and he knows something about this subject. He actually treats PTSD for Native enlisted men. So I'm gonna tap into a little bit of his knowledge and his expertise and his thoughts on the subject. But let me tell you why this subject, began to weigh on me so much this week. In fact, I mean, this is a topic that I've discussed before, because this has to do with hiding uncomfortable truths. I mean, that's part of what this is. Because here's how people deal with cognitive dissonance. They either change their behavior, or they change their attitude, or they suppress it. I would argue that Native people are by and large more of the nature to suppress those tensions. And I would argue that suppression of those tensions is what leads to some of the mental health issues that we have. Everything from substance abuse to depression to some of the psychological symptoms of some of those things, like domestic violence and again substance abuse, but suicide. I mean, these are all things that contribute to all of that. But the other two ways, I mean, when you talk about behavior, what happens is, and if you look at what people have done in generations that were part of that cognitive dissonance, when you see the next generation that says, you know what, no, I'm not going to buy into the church dogma, or I'm not going to subject myself to military service of the United States. That's the behavioral change. Now, the attitude change is the one that when you start saying, well, yeah, but it's not that bad. Attitude is when you say, where you change your belief system towards it. And I think that's the other thing that we have seen. We have seen much of the conversations change. What I'm talking about is how you justify it with your attitude. So you justify a behavior that is inconsistent with your belief system or with your knowledge of history, or the facts. I mean, it's kind of like a climate change denier. That there's another example of cognitive dissonance. The science all says, it tells you that if you think this is all fake news, if you think that it's all fake, and the science says otherwise, and you dismiss that science, you say, yeah, but it's kind of wrong. An example: I watched a video about a guy who was a pilot, and part of his pilot training was to ultimately learn to fly by instruments only. And when you put the hood on, you can't see out the windows anymore, and you're flying by instruments. He found himself doing what everybody else does, find themselves in a spin, because you find reasons to not trust the instruments because you feel something, you think you have your intuition. The fact of the matter is, our brains are not infallible. In fact, they fill in blanks. They fill in the blanks of what we don't know, and sometimes what they fill in is wrong. And so this is where we aren't rational, but we rationalize. We defy rational thought by rationalizing and justifying and trying to somehow validate our behavior. So you have behavior, and then you have the attitude of that you possess. So sometimes your attitude and your behavior, they conflict. I mean, if you're a native person, and you know the story of the doctrine of discovery, the doctrine of Christian discovery, the Trail of Tears, if you know the massacres that went from everything from the Lenape on the island of Manhattan at the hands of the Dutch, to the deaths to the French and to the British and to the Americans, and then you look at things like Sand Creek Massacre, Wounded Knee Massacre, the Moravian Massacre. You look at the executions at Mankato, Minnesota, the residential schools. So you know that history, and you also know that in the midst of all that history, there's inconsistencies, there's contradictions. The contradiction to the doctrine of Christian discovery is the fact that a judge would codify that church dogma, that Vatican dogma, into U.S. law through Johnson v. McIntosh, one of the Cherokee cases. This is Justice John Marshall. Yet, that totally is contradicted by things like the Canandaigua Treaty, where the United States, the lawyers for George Washington, would have language in the Canandaigua Treaty that say, we acknowledge that your land is yours and we will never claim the same. The United States will never claim the same, and you will not be interfered in your free use and enjoyment of your lands. I mean, and it says it like 3 times. There's only 7 articles of the Canandaigua Treaty, and it says it 3 times. And it doesn't just say it in 1794. It is reiterated during the removal period, and even when you get into things like the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, where the United States was in the wake of slavery and the Civil War, would try to resolve the citizenship of black people by saying the 14th Amendment declares that all people living in the United States, born in the United States, and under its jurisdiction are citizens of the United States. That's 1868, but that didn't include us. And there's 2 reasons it didn't include us. Because we weren't necessarily born in the United States, we were born on our own lands. We lived on our own territories, our lands, not their lands. And of course, we weren't under the jurisdiction in 1868. So in 1868, and how do I know that? Because 50 years later, they would pass the Indian Citizenship Act, where they would try to declare that we were citizens. They would still do it in a crafty way, because they wouldn't say all Indians living in the United States. They said living within the United States, understanding that our territories were within their continental borders, right? So they wouldn't even say we were living in the United States. They would say we were living within, and those are different words. And they wouldn't even talk about things like jurisdiction. They would just declare it, because that's what they were trying to get accomplished with it. Because they knew they didn't accomplish it in 1868, so in 1924 they try it. But they also know that it's not successful. So this is the history that most of us know, or know some of it. We all have the sense that we're sovereign, that we're autonomous, that we're distinct people. Our lands are distinct. Yet, our behavior suggests that we are conflicted about whether we are patriotic enough to the United States. How many people are going to celebrate the 4th of July next week? All right, I've got Shane Einen on the phone. So first off, let me introduce him. Dr. Shane Einen, doctor of psychology, and he's a psychoanalyst. Shane, I want to thank you for joining the show.
Hi, John. How you doing tonight?
I'm doing quite well. I got consumed by this a little bit this week, and let me tell you part of what kind of kicked this off. I'm familiar with the concept, and I know it is a theory, and it is a theory that that is used in the treatment of people who are having sometimes psychological disorders associated with this cognitive dissonance. So I understand that. So sure. I don't want to steal your thunder. That's your. But let me tell you why. What kind of got me going on this thing? I showed a film a couple of months ago called Gunazadagi, 270 Years of Resistance. You probably saw it. It's about the Oka crisis. And then this past week I showed Acts of Defiance. And the reason I was showing these films because we live in an era where everybody keeps talking about resistance and about protests, and not just because of Dakota Access Pipeline, but partially because of who's sitting in the White House right now. So I thought maybe it's time that some people saw what resistance looked like from a Mohawk perspective, merely 27 years ago, 1990. But as I watched the films, there were some things that struck me. One of the things is, after all was said and done with it, they part of their celebration as people were released from jail and they were celebrating, the fine work they did in stopping the expansion of the golf course in Gunazadagi and standing their ground on the blocking of the Mercier Bridge. They actually had the reception at the Knights of Columbus. The fact that there's a building called the Knights of Columbus, an organization that still exists in some native territories, and I have to say there were no such things as Knights of Columbus. So let me just say that. But it's an organization, and the fact that this would exist on a native territory, to me, is an example of that cognitive dissonance. I also and I saw a lot of this during the Standing Rock standoff, where Native people who had served in the military wore on their shirt sleeve, even as they protest. They say, "Hey, I served this country," conflicted about whose country they were serving. Was it? They certainly weren't serving by putting on an American uniform or a Canadian uniform. They weren't serving their people; they were serving the United States or Canada. That's the other thing that was demonstrated in the film, in the films about the Oka crisis. The veterans were outraged in Gunawaga and Gunazadagi that the Canadian Army was being used against them. So there was that. So that kind of demonstrated again this conflict they had at having served what was once again becoming the enemy. And even in watching that film through, one of the guys, there was a gentleman, an elderly gentleman who was killed. He had a heart attack after being stoned, meaning not smoking, being hit by rocks by the rioters of Chateauguay, and he died of a heart attack. And he was a veteran. Now, these rioters were given a pass by the provincial police, by the army. They were allowed to do this kind of stuff. And when he died, they buried him with a Canadian flag draped over his coffin. And so as I see this flag waving and this, all of the things that we compromise our position on, knowing where we stand even today and historically, I think that is emblematic to me of not only cognitive dissonance of the individuals, but how we create a cognitive dissonance for an entire community, and that cognitive dissonance becomes a conflict that our people that bear weight on our people. So that's where I want to hand the ball off to you.
Sure. Well, first of all, cognitive dissonance, when you talk about it, what you're actually talking about is the emotional feeling that you get when you're conflicted between your ideals and your beliefs and the behaviors you execute.
Right.
It's a sort of feeling you get of stress. And how you handle that stress is where the cognitive dissonance gets really interesting, and why it's such an interesting concept that you're bringing up. So what you do when you're faced with a situation where you're in a position that you have to make a choice that might betray or go against your values, you have to do a couple different things. You either have to shift your attitudes or beliefs, or you have to rationalize them in some way. And
this is the I think people miss, or you suppress the conflict.
Right.
And so you either change your attitudes or your behavior, or you keep doing what you're doing and live with that conflict. And the reason I say offer that third alternative, because I think that is what bears so heavily on our people in terms of the mental health issues. I think living under the weight of neither addressing that conflict either by changing your attitude or changing your behavior, I think that takes its toll on people.
It does. It really, really does. And I give you a quick little example of this in a really well done experiment that was done back in the 50s called the Milgram experiment.
I know this one.
Oh, okay. so Milgram had this idea. He was trying to understand how the Nazis did what they did, because all these Nazis, you know, they.
You still there? Did I lose you? Or what we do here, Matt?
I don't know.
Let's see if you still got him on there. If you don't, let's get him back. Is he still there?
Yep, Caulfield.
All right, let's get him back. Yeah, I mean, what Shane is talking about is looking at. There was a real question: is how could you influence people in the way? I mean, part of it has to do with the power of persuasion, but this gets tied to this cognitive dissonance, and in this experiment that he's talking about, and I'll let Shane explain it when we get back on the line. It's the challenges of not only live radio but internet strength. So we'll get back. I got Shane Einen, and he's going to talk about again Shane Einen, a doctor of psychology, a psychoanalyst, and he's going to talk about what's it called?
We got him back on.
Is it the Milgram experiment?
Yeah, the Milgram experiment.
Okay, go ahead.
It's a classic. So what he did was he brought in these people from all walks of life and just sat a person in the back in a lab coat. What they did do is shock a person. Now, it wasn't a real shock. It was all done in this way that nobody was actually being harmed. But the individuals didn't know that. So the person sitting in the back had this sort of air authority about them, and they just ordered the people to keep giving shocks. And Stanley Milgram told them they were just doing an experiment on learning. So the people didn't know what was going on. But what was really surprising, what caused all this controversy and still is controversial to this in psychology, is that up to 80% of people would do these shocks to the point of lethality, where it would actually kill the person. So that totally boggled everybody's mind. Trying to point out was that human beings are really good at self-deception, at suppressing what they really would do in situations. And the participants in the study were really distressed by what they had done. It was a form of cognitive dissonance, because they were in a situation where they were actually hurting someone, but they were rationalizing why they were doing it. So that gives you like a real good experiment that showed that people will do things all the time in life that doesn't really comport or go along with their own ideals and beliefs and attitudes. And it does cause a great deal of discomfort and stress. And when you deal with that day to day, it's going to build up, you know. And I think that's a point you're trying to make. And it's a real thing that I think that all Native communities and Native individuals struggle with, is how do you deal with this cognitive dissonance on a day-to-day basis?
Well, and how, I mean, most of the time when people look at this stuff, they look at obviously the pressure, the peer pressure issues that are associated with it, but I think to look at the tensions of cognitive dissonance, it also has not just an individual effect, or not just an individual being affected by community, but community being affected by the individual. And I think that's where I think an analysis of cognitive dissonance in Native territories perhaps has a little bit could be looked at a little bit differently. And I think, go ahead, Matt.
I was just going to say this is a pretty good definition of the way things are happening, and I never realized, you know, there was that type of element.
And there's a clear psychological theory behind all this.
When you first started mentioning this, I was thinking acquiesce.
Yep.
To acquiesce, and it's slightly different.
But it is a little bit, but it's suppression. And I think this is, you know, and Shane,
I think it's maybe the result of being in the process of acquiescence.
Because, you know, they talk about the difference between being rational and rationalizing, and I think that's part of the conversation about this cognitive dissonance. And so you justify your behavior,
right,
by changing your attitudes, even though they're in direct conflict. And I said, I think part of the challenge of being a Native person in a Native community, being faced with all of those forces on the outside, church, military, police, courts, American patriotism, racism, all of that stuff, it still leaves us conflicted. We never can rationalize it all away, and so the weight of that, I think, is where, and this is where I think leads to so many of the psychological problems and the mental health issues we have on native territories.
I agree. Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, you're constantly dealing with a stress of like being between two value systems. When you're on Facebook or on social media, one of the things that I find interesting is how Native people will attack each other to sort of reinforce
crabs in a bucket, right?
Yeah, the crabs in a bucket. Like, somebody will make a great point about pointing out somebody's, I don't know, non-traditional stance or maybe a hypocrisy. And then the counterpoint will be, well, you're using a phone, which is the white man's tool. And so how do you square all these things? And that's the difficulty is, where do you find yourself when you're trying to align your attitudes with your behavior?
Well, and I'll take it to another level. Look at from a native government standpoint. Here's the other challenge. We've got tribal governments that find themselves either being enamored by the man who sits in the White House or their local politicians. They oftentimes, millions of dollars are flowing from native territories into lobbying efforts, trying to get federal government and state governments to either legislate, favorably towards them or some of these other issues. So I think this is some of the challenges. I mean, we have native people, organizations, governments that fund campaigns, non-native campaigns. I think this is more of that cognitive dissonance.
It is, yes.
Hey, we're going to take a break here. We're at the bottom of the hour. Can you hang on for a little bit more longer?
Yeah, sure. No problem.
All right, we'll take a break here. What are we going out here with, Matt?
This is Pappy John's band, Resonation.
All right, some good instrumental from these guys, and we'll go out with this, and we'll come back with more from Shane Einan, and we're talking cognitive dissonance. Thanks for coming back. Hey, I want to remind people about our sponsors, because I know we're in the throes of a pretty deep conversation, so I don't want to miss out on giving my credit to my sponsors: Ross and Holly John and the RJE family of businesses, Eric White and ERW Enterprises, guys like Ed Schindler sitting right here in the studio, Tracy Brown, Cynthia Trice, Scott Snyder, Neville Springs, Sugar Montour, and many others who've helped this program continue to educate, entertain, and inform for the last 7 years. We're in our 8th year now. I thank all of you for joining in the fight and doing your part. I also want to thank Unity Stream and Apache Net Radio for providing our streaming for our Let's Talk Native radio network. I want to thank CKWE for simulcasting our shows and for rebroadcasting our shows, as well as Netroots Radio, Real People's Media, Indigenous Resistance Radio, and all of you who share the videos and the audios that we post. So I want to give props to all those that help get our message out, get our conversation out. That's what the program is about. The program is about continuing and to encourage a conversation on things we might not always be prepared to talk about. Ed, you wanted to weigh in a little bit here. What are your thoughts on where the conversation has gone so far?
One of the things I think is got to be seen and is important for the people is that a lot of Native people, you're talking their community, how the community affects and the beliefs of the community affects the individual, but then the behavior of the individual affects the community. And it's one of the things that we still have as a Native people is the community, and the commonality between the beliefs and the teachings, and then there's the commonality of what's being lost, and that's the behavior of the people, which jeopardizes the future generations. All of those things are based upon the fact that we identify as community.
But they also add to the cognitive dissonance,
right.
Because again, when you have even in a community where you have longhouse people who are perhaps compromising some of those views,
yes.
because of again, some of the behaviors. Alcohol is one of the things that comes to mind. I'm not saying everybody in the longhouse is a drunk. I'm not suggesting that, but we certainly do have alcohol issues here, even though we have cultural prohibitions against it. We have longhouse, we have church folks, we have people who are whose lives are predominantly affected by the work that they do off our territory. So they may work for the state or work in the university system. And then you've got people whose livings come from living on territory, either whether they work for the nation directly in the governance or in nation enterprises or in private sector, people doing any number of things. All of those things, which are all part of the community, oftentimes can lend to the tensions that I think still fit in that box of cognitive dissonance, because there are things that we do with our behaviors that seem to defy, and that's when I talk about the history and I think about genocide and the atrocities that have been committed against our people. You actually have our history and our knowledge that stand in stark contrast to the way we live our lives. And I'm not talking about whether we wear blue jeans, drive a car, or have a cell phone, but I'm talking about how do we identify ourselves? Do we identify ourselves as Americans or as New Yorkers? Do we recognize state jurisdiction, and not just from a political standpoint or even a legal standpoint, but from a practical standpoint? Do we resolve conflicts ourselves here, or do we have a tendency to we're going to call the cops?
Yeah.
I mean, so that to me, and Shane, I'm going to drop it off to you here. I think all of that stuff lends itself to the problems, and they percolate. And I would argue that some of the cognitive dissonance that we face here on Native territories are in many ways more debilitating than just whether you decide that knowing that eating too much is bad for you. I mean, we talked about the idea that you've got a 300-pound nurse or a doctor who smokes. I mean, those are
standing outside smoking.
Yeah. You got a 400-pound nurse who's smoking during her breaks working in a hospital. They know better, yet they still do these bad behaviors.
Well,
but
I think if they know that if something happens, they got help right there, so they don't have to go too far.
But there's a rationalization, right?
Yeah, it might be a rationalization. Yeah.
Well, and that's exactly what I'm talking about. But I think there's that kind of cognitive dissonance may have adverse effects to an individual, and I think the same things that we experience here on Native territories have these detrimental effects to individuals. But my issue is that they have a detrimental effect to the community and to as a people, and I think that's to me that's a whole nother level of the tensions caused by cognitive dissonance.
Yes. Yeah, I agree, and the tensions that you feel coming off of cognitive dissonance and how you can, where I'd like to also talk about a little bit too in the healing aspect. A lot of these things we talk about, we just kind of layer up problem after problem in Native communities, but we don't talk about how do you get out of these kind of things, and it doesn't get talked about too much. I see that when I do my work a lot. You can layer up these problems and say, okay, this is the cause, this is why it's happening, but how do you get out of it? Because then you can feel kind of hopeless and trapped in that situation.
Well, and I think the choices there are somewhat narrow because they're obviously you can suppress them, which I think are have their own effects. We can't change the history. We can't change what we know in terms of what our history is, what our ancestry is, what our culture and the deliberate attempts to defile our culture and our people. So it
Sure.
seems to me the only thing that we can change, because we can't change our core belief systems. So our attitudes aren't really what we can change unless we ignore that history. What we really have to concentrate on is how do we change our behavior?
Yeah. And changing behavior, getting in touch. Now, the thing about cognitive dissonance you have to understand is a lot of times when it's happening to people in real life, in real moments, we're talking about it theoretically, but
Yeah.
when you're actually living it, it's a really unconscious process. It's really happening at the subconscious. You just know you're angry. You just know you're really upset about something.
Or you really know you have a desire to go get a drink, or one of the examples. I mean, because some people say that you rationalize that the choice you're making is worth the consequences. I don't think we even think about it that deep. I think we just sometimes
we
make a
don't.
decision, and then we rationalize it afterwards.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Well, what you're doing is, okay, so you have the stress, but then the drink is how you're trying to suppress it. Like you're trying to push it down.
Mm-hmm.
I would deal with this a lot with that were in Afghanistan. Where they were really struggling with what their mission was. What were they doing there? What was the whole point of all this? And they would come back and they were dealing with cognitive dissonance. They were dealing with my beliefs about what I was doing and what I was actually doing in real life weren't adding up to me in my own mind.
Mm-hmm.
Would be a solution to it, or punch a wall, or do something very destructive to themselves.
Well, or I mean, I think part of it is acknowledging that the decision you made to place yourself in a place where you have no choices, because once you enlist and you're under the command of somebody else, you can
Exactly.
acknowledge after that choice was a bad choice. The problem is we oftentimes don't want to acknowledge that we've made bad choices.
Exactly. And that's why, one of the big things about healing is becoming very, very aware of taking that deep dive into yourself about what your values actually are and where you're really at. Like when I work with people, sometimes it's really hard to admit that you've given your power over to somebody else. You don't want to admit that. You don't want to admit that to yourself. That's actually worse in some ways. But once you get there and you can actually sit with that and live with that for a moment and handle that emotion, then you don't make the self-destructive behaviors anymore. And that's what the real deep dive into healing from cognitive dissonance is all about, is getting real clear about where you're at in the world, not deluding yourself or trying to rationalize it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's real hard for people to do. Here I am, I'm a Mohawk, but I go work on the steel down in New York City
Mm-hmm.
to pay for my family, and I'm away from them for weeks and weeks at a time. And that was a choice that a lot of people made at one point
Sure.
to make money. But
Mm-hmm.
they had, what were they doing in their downtime? They're lonely. They're down there in New York City.
You hit the bar.
They might be drinking. Yeah, you hit
Yeah.
the bar. That's how you're dealing with that stress. And for Native people, it's a constant problem because everything you're doing throughout the day, from the moment you wake up, is a constant reminder of your situation in life.
Exactly.
That you're powerless in some way, if you think of it that way.
Or you feel that
in
you
some
are.
part.
You feel that you are.
Yes.
Because I always want to be, sometimes we make declarations like that. And I think I participate in a roundtable discussion with some black leaders from Chester, Pennsylvania to Westchester, New York. And I oftentimes will hear sometimes a declaration made like, white people have all the power. And I'm thinking, no, only if we view it that way. And we still have power. And so, but it's interesting because as I look at this and I look at people of color, we have that challenge because I'll never understand. Because Southern Baptists, the Baptist denomination of the church became so predominant amongst black people, even though it was church dogma that rationalized the use of slavery. And that's part of that. So it isn't just a Native issue. But I think the
It's,
community
it's
issue
all
is
it's all it's all it's all colonized people.
sure. And Matt, you want
I
to
mean-
weigh in?
Yeah.
Ed, go ahead.
I just wanted to mention about for most people, but for us, we go through education system with a curriculum of New York State, which basically teaches past tense. We don't exist
Yeah.
in their eyes. Okay, therefore, our culture, our language, our history, it's irrelevant in their eyes, and that's where it ends up being basically a question for us: as do we go according to what they've indoctrinated us with, or do we learn our ways? And a lot of people, it's too much of a challenge to learn those ways, even though it's really, because those ways really basically developed a skill for communication, developed a skill for producing food, and for being community. And
Yeah.
those things are being lost.
I just wanted to say, what you're talking about, say an enlisted person is tied to that, and their feelings are that choice, But think about a native person that's inescapable. You're that person no matter what.
Right.
I mean, it's
you
not
can't
a
change
choice.
You can't change your color.
So
your
is
skin,
that
right?
by that standard? Is that compounded then, or is it any different? Or
Well, my point is that because it is our history, and we can't shake that. We know that historically Native people and people of color, but Indigenous people in particular, have been victimized so much by the colonizers. And knowing that, the question is, does our behavior, are we responsibly behaving in such a way to address that, or rather than just submit to it? And I think that's where some of the tensions come from.
But think about this though. What if your perception of that history is totally wrong, and say you've been told that by your educators, you've been told that growing up as a community member, certain things are a certain way because of this or that, and that might not even be true. And now just think of that type of even
American dream, God bless America, all that stuff. No, I hear what you're saying.
Well, even that's why we wore the war bonnets in the 50s and 60s, because we didn't have our
we
own
lost our identity. Yeah, we're reaching.
I mean, that's got to play into it too somehow, I would think.
Yeah, I think that the loss of all that stuff is part of that issue. But I think what it comes down to still, and this is where Shane, I'd like you to weigh in, is I guess part of it, we talk about being rational versus rationalizing. I think part of what we have to rationalize is acting rational. I mean, I think sometimes we get so sucked into what the dominant culture is expecting of us, whether it's, whether it's, submitting to that education system or military service or church dogma or political will from the outside. But we do have choices. So when I look and realize that we can't change our history, we can't change our identity really, unless we abandon our identity. So our real choices are left with how do we change our behavior. And so I think that's part of the whole thing is can you change your behavior without necessarily turning into some sort of radicalized fundamentalist, I guess.
I think that was my draw when I first heard talking about great law, because it was rational, it was based on nature, and it was simplified. To me, that was the strong points of that. And it made sense. You didn't have to believe anything. That if you can observe it in nature, you can see things happening right there. Look at this is how the fish do it. This is how the animals do it. This is why bugs do that. It's not made up. It's there and it's witnessable. That's to me, that's what made sense for me.
Pragmatic. Yep. Yeah. So I mean, I guess that my question to Shane, to you is how do we prepare ourselves for a change in behavior so we can reconcile that cognitive dissonance, so we can no longer have that tension? Because I mean, can we live our lives in a way that isn't going to be rebellious necessarily, or a flat out revolution? I say that it is, but part of it is like I said, rationalizing, and justifying a change in your behavior so it's consistent with our culture.
Yeah, and that's the sweet spot you're trying to figure out, and that's I think what a lot of people are trying to figure out. Where does that lie? And it's interesting. Before you mentioned, a thought occurred to me about how you do this. So you mentioned, like, how do these people that were enslaved in the South, and generations of people were enslaved, they entered into this church that really wasn't part of their own belief system. But out of that process came Martin Luther King.
Mm-hmm.
One of the interesting things when you watch what Martin Luther King and you observe his behavior, and as a psychologist, is fascinating to me, because what he did in the civil rights movement was to take cognitive dissonance in white America and mirror it back at them. And you see this over and over again in his speeches. So he stayed true to who he was and his own dignity and his own path in life. But what he did is he took it in a way and used the religion and showed white people their own cognitive dissonance, so that civil rights could actually happen.
Where Malcolm X, I think, concentrated more on showing black people their cognitive dissonance.
Exactly. Well, yeah, and Malcolm X, he had an evolution and a development,
Mm-hmm.
and he wasn't a static human being.
Right.
And he changed a lot, but
nor was Martin Luther King. I mean, the idea that he moved into even being an anti-war advocate was an example of that.
Exactly. Yeah, anti-war and anti-poverty.
Sure.
Exactly. But the thing with Dr. King is that all comported with his own beliefs and attitudes, and that was how he was able to do what he did. And for Native communities, I think that's part of the model you could look at. How do you take these things that you're constantly bearing up under, and it's causing you all the stress? First, you have to admit that's what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to have that soul searching. Like, I'm in this situation constantly where I'm under stress because
Mm-hmm.
the Anglo-American system is causing me the stress. So what do I need to do? What deep dive do I have to take into my own beliefs and attitudes to find a third way? Because I could just rebel, and what that's going to do is cause more pain.
Well, and this is where a lot of the things that we talk about on this program has to do with community, and I think
right.
the sense is when you look at the behaviors that we adopt that conform to American culture, for instance, or Canadian culture.
Yep.
What we end up buying into is not only the capitalist system, but all in global economic system, but we buy into the whole notion that local doesn't matter so much, and I say that's the shift
Yes.
back. That when you can make some things that are problematic from the outside, is from a global standpoint or a national standpoint or a continental standpoint, you can make it irrelevant if you put enough concentration into not just family but community, neighborhood, nation, and address it that way. And I think part of the reason I wanted to bring up this psychological theory is because I think understanding it is further justification for building strong communities and and not necessarily buying in to the global citizen concept, because that makes so much of this stuff irrelevant, and it tries to make irrelevant our culture, our history, or the history, and I think that's part of the process. I believe.
I agree with you. I think that the more you focus on what you can control in your own world, the more powerful you're going to feel. If you focus on your family, your bigger family, your clan, and then your bigger community, you are feeling more powerful, and you're going to experience less cognitive dissonance because you feel.
And I'm glad you said it just that way, because this is where pulling back your reliance on state and federal programs or politicians, pulling back on reliance on the outside law enforcement and judicial system, pulling back on your commitment to American patriotism or Canadian patriotism. I mean, I don't know if you've been watching any of the stuff going on in Canada as they celebrate their 150th Canada Day or whatever else. I mean, you can see the tensions because more and more Native people are saying no, I'm standing up to this, and I think standing up to it isn't just standing against that nationalism, and Canadian or American nationalism or globalism. It's standing for your own people and your own identity.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're right on with that. That's exactly what you would want to do. and not feel so much pain and sorrow and stress every day. You would feel like, hey, look, I'm doing something.
Well, and I
That
think
is-
part of that is
it's-
identifying the specific things you can do that will embolden or fulfill that sense of community. I think because we can see the easy stuff. I mean, go out and get a job. Well, what about stay in and get a job? Go
Yes.
out and join the military because because it's an honorable thing to do and it's patriotic. We can rationalize again all of these other things that will create cognitive dissonance, where and I think part of building that rationale to do the things that are community building, that build your own sense of and reinforce your own sense of identity. Go ahead, Ed.
Sure.
I wanted to share with you, because you were talking about how a lot of people they go through the stress of whatever it is that they believe to be the truth. But one of the things that I think is relevant to us in terms of change is a quote I've got. It says, "Throughout life, pain is inevitable. Suffering is optional. If we understand that we have the power to choose, then we have given ourselves that strength to be able to make change." Okay?
Yes.
That, I think, is something people have to come to understand, because otherwise they're leaving their power with the people who have been basically indoctrinating them, whether it's with education or economy or just plain old beliefs.
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up because on Tuesday it is the anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. That line is specifically in the Declaration. It says it is the human condition, essentially, and I'm paraphrasing, to endure suffering, and that's the problem. The problem is so even the colonists in their relationship with Great Britain, in 1776, were acknowledging that that enduring the suffering is something that people have a tendency to do, and rather than standing up to correct it. And I think that's what this cognitive dissonance acknowledgement is, and then taking the action to say, look, you don't have to have that conflict if you change, if you decide, no, I'm not going to be the victim anymore. I'm not going to participate in the very systems that victimize me. And I think that's the tensions that I talk about when I refer to cognitive dissonance in native territories.
Yeah, and those are the choices you really have to look at. Is what are you doing day by day, moment by moment.
And it's not an all or nothing. It's not an all or nothing proposition either, though.
No.
And that's I think, because I don't want to make it sound like we have to draw a line in the sand. So I mean I want to throw that into it even as you were going on. But continue.
Yeah, you're right. It's not all or nothing. I mean, it's what it's really about is coming down to, look, you're gonna have to make choices every single day of your life, and you just have to make sure to reduce your stress level that you're making choices that are in alignment with what you really value. And if you say to yourself inside that, hey, I really value my community, my family, my clan, my nation, my culture, my language, well, then I have to give over some of that. And then what happens is when you do that, you really get a clear perspective on, okay, so I am earning money to help me do this thing that I really care about. And that's where my energy is really at. That's where my heart's at. Instead of walking around sort of unconsciously about the whole thing, feeling the stress and tension.
Well, and my point is developing a process that allows you to take the steps to get there. Because I said, it's not an all or nothing proposition. So if you can adopt a mindset and a principle that you're going to begin to take the steps to where your behavior lines up with your belief system, I think that's part of the healing process.
Yeah.
It is, yeah, it is.
Well, Shane, I want to thank you so much for joining me. This is a conversation that I don't think is happening in our territories enough. And I think bringing you in, especially somebody who does this for a living, psychiatry is your profession. I think you added this conversation. I'd like to have you back. I think this is a conversation we need to continue, and maybe as you kind of formulate a specific approach that perhaps we can employ. I think that's something that all of us are kind of challenging ourselves with.
We've all been trying to make that, connect the dots to figure this all out. And I think that what Ross was talking about with the declaration or the description of our traumas and stuff.
Create a trauma list. Yeah.
Yep, that's a pretty good place to look at as well. But you know, like I said, making this aware and giving me this definition really ticks it. You know, puts me up one more notch.
Yep.
And I'm glad that you blrought this to to light. Like I said, I always thought that there was something there, but it
well, and sometimes a definition does help.
Mm-hmm.
And when you understand that this is a psychological theory that has been analyzed and again tested, and there's a variety of tests. It's not just the shock test that Shane talked about. This has been replicated in many other models up to fairly recently.
I mean, it's like kind of the same stuff that I put together, but don't quite know how to identify it. But then once you say that, it makes sense.
That's the reason for the show. The show is to help people. Gather their thoughts on something that they know is there, and Shane, you've contributed and helped us in a big way. So again, I want to thank you for joining us, and we'll definitely get you back. We'll definitely get you back.
Thanks.
Yeah.
All right. That's Dr. Shane Einen. He's Mohawk or Seneca. I didn't even ask him. I know he's Haudenosaunee.
Plug him back in.
All right. We can say, Shane, you still there?
Yeah.
Are you? What's your native ancestry? Is it Mohawk or Seneca?
That side is Seneca, and mom's side is Ojibwe.
Okay, all right. So I just wanted to make sure that I got that right. Seneca and Ojibwe. Okay. And Shane is a doctor of psychology and a psychoanalyst who has worked specifically with not just native but native people who are suffering from PTSD from being from the military service and actually a great person to talk about this very subject. So I want to thank Shane for joining us. Look, we may even continue this conversation. I got a couple of things we'll bring up on Monday. I want to talk about what's that?
Perhaps around a fire too.
Yeah, and, perhaps around our fires as well. That's more of a place for the conversation. Look, come Monday, I'm going to talk a little bit about a case that was disposed of, where my friend, young man Sean Snyder, had been fined $1.25 million for driving a truckload of native branded cigarettes from Cattaraugus to Ganyonge, and he was pulled over in 2012, and that fine has finally been canceled by a judge. I was one of the folks who got to testify in that hearing, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. I wanted people to understand that we do win sometimes. Even though I don't advocate using their court systems, when we're dragged into it, we have to be smart about how we represent ourselves there. Matt's done it.
I used it and it worked.
And now we've seen it work again. So we'll talk about that a little bit more on Monday. So join us here Monday on Let's Talk Native. I want to thank you for listening and thank you for joining us. Nyawe.